Morning all. With us, we have a very distinguished speaker, that's the Shikshi man. Details of who Shikshi man is, because it's a long list actually. So what I will do is that I'll briefly introduce that's the Shikshi man. And that's the Shikshi man is a distinguished fellow in the program at Prudence. And he has a long public career, and that includes National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India, and from 2010 to 2014. And before that, Ambassador Shikshi ran was the Foreign Secretary and the Ambassador to China. And in fact, I was told this morning that Ambassador Shikshi stayed in India for 3 years when he was a child, so in Tibet. So Ambassador knows lots about Tibet, and Ambassador knows lots about China because we must deal with Chinese issues. So I will not go all these things. So I will let the floor to Ambassador so that we'll have much more time for you to talk about China-India relations in the Tibet region. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you for having me to speak to you. I was asked to speak about India-China relations and the Tibet factor in India-China relations. And actually, the fact is you can't separate, these three nations from each other because Tibet has always been a major factor in India-China relations. For a very long period in history, if you look at it, if you look back, India had a relationship primarily with Tibet, not so much with China. And it was really, Tibet was the intermediary in this relationship. It's interesting, and people talk of centuries of India-China relations in the past. But if you look at what was actually happening through the travel, trade, and exchange of ideas, of people, of pilgrims, of goods, of technology. But it was intermediated through Central Asia, through Tibet, and through Burma. And there was very little to do with each other between India and China, either politically or militarily. So in a very strange way, Tibet was central to that relationship. And not just to the transmission and the preservation of Buddhism and of religious traditions, but also in various other ways, language, etc., and technologies and trade. But also, by the time we came to the modern states, and India and China made those transitions because of imperialism, actually, to building modern Westphalian states in the 20th century. So by the time we get the Republic of India in 47, in 50 actually with the Constitution, and the People's Republic of China in 49, which are states in the modern sense. Before that we were nations, we were civilizations, but not really states in the Western modern sense. When you become that, and Tibet doesn't quite make that full transition, has the same personality in the past throughout, but doesn't quite make that transition in an international sense. By the time you get to that, actually these new states, India and China, have no real experience of dealing with each other, politically or militarily. They're new states, so they're still learning how to be states. And the movement in India, and to a certain extent in China also, had created this idea that somehow there was a common Pan-Asian past, that we had a long history of working together, and of course it was a peaceful past, because frankly we didn't have anything to do with each other. For India had always had a boundary, a border with Tibet, until the PLA moved into China in 1950, which is the first time actually that there was such a thing as an India-China border. And it's interesting, the Chinese kept saying that this needs to be, but started saying in 59 formally, but that this boundary therefore needs to be demarcated. For India, there was custom, tradition, history, everything with Tibet, which had actually established where the boundary was. And there was this huge geographical feature, the world's biggest mountains and dividing the two. So for India, this was a settled boundary, and we couldn't understand what the Chinese were talking about. So we ended up with the world's largest boundary dispute. And the Chinese would use history or India, the relationship between India and Tibet selectively to support what they wanted on the border. A boundary dispute with China, between India and China, which actually was 138,000 square miles. That's bigger than more than half the members of the UN, are smaller than that. It's a huge dispute, and the dispute fought a war in 62, in which again, Tibet was a major factor. Because what the Chinese had done in Tibet, especially after 1956, and you know this better than me, had provoked not just Tibetan resistance, but armed resistance. And by 59, it was a full-fledged guerrilla war against Chinese control. Chinese blamed India and the US, but assumed that India was behind this. And that was actually one big factor when we now know what happened in the Chinese Politburo before the 62 war, when they took the decisions to go to war. And we know that their fear of losing Tibet and the thought that the world was behind India in promoting a war in Tibet, I think that was one major reason that Mao Zedong used to convince the Politburo to go to war with India in 62. So Tibet has been a factor which has been central to the relationship for a very, very long time. And after 62, it got frozen. Now, Tibet has not just been a factor in the direct India-China bilateral relationship, but it has also, and this it's both unfortunate and fortunate, it has also been a factor in great power politics, which is, in one sense, not a very happy situation, because when you become a lever or an instrument in somebody else's politics, then, frankly, the level of support, the commitment varies depending on their politics. And that is true of all the great powers, whether it's the US, the UK, whoever it is. It was useful when anti-communism drove US policy, it was useful. When, after 71, when Kissinger, Nixon go to China and basically form a strategic alliance against the Soviet Union, then suddenly levels of US support and interest will decline, at least officially in the administration. Not popular, not outside. And so, because of that situation, because it became an instrument in a larger great power play, it became a very complicated issue to Tibet. And that also affected India-China relations and the way both China looked at the issue and India looked at the issue. Now, India itself, after independence, chose to deal with the issue as one that, and because there was no international support after 1950, in fact even before 1950, and because India had very few options actually in 48, 49, 50, when the Chinese were clearly about to move in to Tibet, India chose to deal with the issue directly, trying to keep as much autonomy as possible in Tibet. You can say they were maybe naive to believe the assurances that were held out in the 54 agreement, for instance, but we all know how that ended. And we know how, and one big reason for the shift in Indian opinion in China and the hardening of Indian positions, frankly, vis-a-vis China, was China's behavior in Tibet through the 50s. And the kind of reactions, especially after His Holiness came to India in 59, the kind of this, it actually, in effect, made it very clear to most Indians what they were dealing with in the relationship with China. And since that period, if you look at it, India-China relations have been very complicated, but complicated in both senses. There are difficult issues to the relationship which neither side has managed to actually settle. They have managed them, but they haven't settled them. And they have been there now for 50 years, over 50 years. At the same time, because they are big neighbors, because they share a periphery, because they have a certain interest in their own development and therefore don't want to get into trouble with each other, don't want external distractions, they also cooperate. They also work together. It took all the way from 1962 until 1988 for India and China to work out a way of doing this, of doing both simultaneously. Compete, discuss, argue about whatever on the difficult issues, on the boundary, on what happens in the periphery, which we both share, because each one thinks, and this periphery affects our security, affects China's security, across the board, whether it's South Asia, Southeast Asia, Myanmar, right through South China Sea, East China Sea. We do that, but in '88, during Rajiv Gandhi's visit, we agreed that we wouldn't allow the differences and the disputes to prevent us from cooperating. So we started trading, we started exchanges of people, other functional exchanges. Trade went from about less than 2 billion in '88 to 73 billion last year. And there are now almost 18,000 Indian students in China. So there's all the normal parts of a relationship, flights, this, that, all that happens. The Chinese have invested, actually in the last 5 years, they've put about $3.23 billion into the Indian economy. So the normal parts of the relationship go on, and we've cooperated internationally where we see we have a common interest, whether it was climate change negotiations, whether it was the WTO, where we saw something. So you had a sort of a modus vivendi, a way of living together, which managed your differences, saw where you could cooperate internationally and bilaterally, and you muddled along. And the reason you did this was in both cases, because primarily you wanted to transform your own country. China was doing reform in Open Door, and after Tiananmen, they were very nervous that they were next in the list of communist regimes that the West would try and change. They toppled the Soviet Union, and so they thought they had to spend some time quietly building themselves up, which they did under Deng Xiaoping's 24-character strategy: keep your head down, hide your lights, don't take leadership. For India as well, it wasn't enough that, the 3.5% rate of growth of our economy clearly wasn't enough. By Rajiv Gandhi's time, it was clear we needed to kickstart the economy, open it up, do much more. And then with the economic reforms in '91, and we managed actually over 30 years of 6.5% growth, which we had never achieved. In fact, nobody else in history has ever achieved except China. So both sides had to concentrate on building themselves up, doing things at home, and didn't want external distractions. And China was our biggest distraction. For China, we were one of their big distractions, and the US probably much bigger. But, and so we got along and we kept peace. The trouble is, the result of that was this tremendous growth spurt in both countries. Both countries changed in both their societies, their economies, at an unprecedented historic rate. It's interesting, if you look at it, in 1981, both India and China together accounted for less than 4.5% of world GDP in PPP terms. The US was around 27-28%. By 2016, India and China together are around 26, almost 27% of world GDP in PPP terms. The US is still around 26-27%. So it hasn't dropped. One who's dropped tremendously is Europe, who has lost share to basically to India and China and the other emerging economies, if you look at it. So they were successful at what they were doing, which is to develop. But the end result is that both countries' interests have also grown. Today, China is more dependent on the rest of the world than she's ever been in history. She needs the world for markets, she needs it for energy, she needs it for technology, she needs it for raw materials to feed that big economy that she's built. And this is not a position China is used to ever in history. Remember Qianlong told George III when he wrote to him to open up trade, "Don't we need nothing that you have." But that China is quite happy. But since you are desperate for our goods, you can trade in Canton. And you can send your people once a year to Canton to trade. That's not true today. Today, for India also, the similar phenomenon. And when we started reform in 1991, roughly 15.3% of GDP was external merchandise trade. That's trade in goods, exports and imports. By 2014, it was 49.3% of GDP. That's almost half India's GDP, depends on what we do with the rest of the world. For China, that proportion now is around 44% of GDP, which again is very high. So, frankly, it becomes very important what happens outside. We have an interest in what happens outside. We will both try to use whatever power we have to shape that environment around us, because it affects our future in a way that it never did before. And we rub up against each other. In 91, most of our foreign trade, this 15.2%, went west through Suez. By 2014, almost half of it went east through the South China Sea. So what's happening? This is the same period when China is now drawing lines saying South China Sea belongs to them. So you're starting to rub up against each other. For us now, freedom of navigation in the South China Sea has become an Indian interest, which it wasn't before. Whereas for the Chinese also, by 2008, they called South China Sea a core interest. And you see this phenomenon everywhere. You see India and China, not just through the periphery. The Chinese are now in the Indian Ocean, which they never were before, 20 years ago. And for Indians, obviously, this is a matter of concern. When you see the PLA Navy off your coast, you start worrying. So, as a result of our success, I mean, we are victims of our success. We actually have a relationship which is getting more complicated. So you today have the situation where I was saying just now, even if you settle the boundary question, you still have other issues between the two. You still need to find a new way of managing this new relationship between two countries whose interests have grown, who are now still neighbors and next to each other, share the same territory, and have a whole new set of security issues, maritime security, global commons, cyber, for instance. I mean, these are areas where boundaries no longer work, but where you both have issues to deal with. And so, if you say, is the Tibet factor in India-China relations, Tibet has always been critical and crucial. And for China, interestingly, the more their sense of being a great power has grown, the more sensitive they are to being embarrassed or to being shown as weak. And if you look at the way they react now, things that were acceptable 20 years ago, by the Tibetan community, by other countries, and so on, are no longer acceptable for China. Now, in a sense, that sensitivity is both a strength and a weakness. I mean, it shows how strong they think they are, but it also shows it's also a weakness to be so nervous about things that in the past at least you didn't bother, you claimed not to bother. So, is Tibet still a factor? Yes, it's still a factor in India-China relations. But it's a different kind of factor because it's operating in a very different context. India-China relations themselves have moved. They now have a much bigger scope to the relationship than they were before. So the individual salience of Tibet may not be what it was, but its significance and its potential is as great as it was before. Where do we go from here? It's difficult to say, frankly, because then you're asking, so what's going to happen in India, what's going to happen in China, what's going to happen to the world? I wish I knew. If I knew, I'd be a millionaire. No, but seriously, I think it's clear that the world today is much more uncertain than it was before. It's no longer either a Cold War bipolar world where you could predict two alliance systems where they would go. It's no longer a unipolar world as it was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where the US was the sole superpower. Today, as I said, the economic power is much more evenly distributed in the world. So the world is actually multipolar economically, in an economic sense. But militarily, the US still spends more on defense than the next 10 countries put together. So militarily, it's still a unipolar world. And politically, frankly, we don't know. The world is completely confused. And we don't know what Mr. Trump is going to do. You have this phenomenon of strong authoritarian leaders who base their legitimacy increasingly on nationalism because they can no longer deliver the same kind of economic growth. They can't claim ideological legitimacy as they used to in the past. So increasingly they rely on a form of chauvinism, ultranationalism. And this is not unique to any one or two elements. There's Abe, Xi Jinping, India, you go to Turkey, Russia. Trump is the last actually, they're just learning from Asia. But if you look at that phenomenon, this is not a situation where it's easy to make the kinds of compromises, the give and take, the bargaining that diplomacy requires, or handling crises managers. So you have a situation where you have great power rivalry again. Again, you look at China-US relations, which are so critical. They're completely interdependent economically. You look at the large US corporations, huge proportions of their profits come out of China. Large corporations, not the small ones. But if you ask the ordinary American, he thinks he's lost jobs, he's lost economic competitiveness to China, and that's what Trump is cashing in on. So you have tremendous economic complementarity and interdependence between the two. It's codependence, really. And yet there's strategic rivalry. You see it everywhere through the Asia-Pacific. You see it in the arms build-up that's going on throughout the region. And so this is a very uncertain world that we've come into. Where does that leave issues like Tibet, India-China relations? I think you've seen one result of this increased uncertainty in the Wuhan summit, where both India and China, essentially both leaders, said we have other things to do. We don't want the kinds of friction that we've seen in the India-China relations for the last few years to take over the relationship. And you've seen multiple signs of friction, because the old modus vivendi, the 1988 modus vivendi that I described to you, that no longer works. If our interests have changed, if India has changed, China has changed, the international context has changed, that modus vivendi is no longer sufficient. That's why you have problems about NSG membership. China's worried about your attitude to Belt and Road. You worry about China and the Indian Ocean, and you have Masood Azhar listing as an issue. These are all signs of stress, of friction in a relationship. And you need a new modus vivendi, but you haven't actually arrived at one because things are so uncertain around you. And also because everybody is convinced that tomorrow I'm going to be better off. I mean, India's growing, China's growing. Each one thinks, so why fix anything now? If I fix it today, I'm fixing present inequality. Stability is not my goal, therefore. My goal is to survive till tomorrow when I am better off, when I'm stronger, when I'm in a better position to negotiate. In any case, this kind of ultranational world, ultranationalist world, is not a place where negotiation flourishes or where you find peaceful solutions to issues. So you see the kind of thing that happened in Wuhan, where both leaders signal, we don't want trouble. But they haven't settled things. It's not as though they've actually formed a new strategic framework for the relationship. But they're saying we have other things to do. Maybe it's something as simple as Mr. Modi has an election to win. Maybe Xi Jinping has other preoccupations internally and with the US and other places, with Japan, in South China Sea, Taiwan is a big issue for him. So maybe that's where it is. But that's the kind of uncertainty we're operating in, and I think we must expect that for each of us. So when you look at the Tibet factor, or you look at India-China relations, I think if you look at it from the outside in, from the kind of context in which we're operating and how things have changed in this new geopolitical situation, I think maybe you need to moderate expectations. Maybe this is a time for the world itself to keep its head down, hide its light, and not take leadership and to see. Because things are changing so fast that it's very difficult in the middle of change to actually say, okay, this is the way forward, these are the things we do. I'd better stop there. I've gone on and on. I'd rather hear what you think about Tibet as a factor in India-China relations and what you think of India-China relations and where it's going. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks also for overall gist about how relations proceed in these new narratives. But as you rightly said, now Tibet is one of the factors, not the factor. Right. So early days in 1959, because Shaumula came on and off to Delhi, specifically for 3 years, for the major development of Tibet. Now the Tibet factor is one factor with this multiplicity of complexity of this relationship which India and China has. So one thing I would like to ask you is, since you yourself served in the foreign services, and your father also served in the foreign services, and your father has been in the constitution in Lhasa, and you being in China as the ambassador. So how do you perceive China's attitude towards Tibet?
It depends on which China you're talking about. You know, if you say official China, the Chinese Communist Party, their attitude has been clear that this is an area that needs to be made like the rest of China from their point of view. And that's so when they talk about integration, liberation, all these are words to say how do we make Tibet like the rest of China. And which is why you see what you see, which is population movements, you see all these, the way TR, the boundaries have been drawn, and everything you will see, whether we were talking about language policy earlier and so on. But you know, it's interesting, when you talk to ordinary Chinese, they have a very different attitude to Tibet. And even official, I mean, at the ordinary level, there is great respect, I think, for a culture, for a civilization, and certainly with the increasing return of Buddhism in Chinese society in the last 20 years, there's a turning back to, and some respect. And that's something which, now in the Chinese system, this doesn't translate into government policy. That's not the way it works, and I don't think we should expect it either. But I think we need in our minds to draw some distinction here. You know, not just say all Chinese, or, you know, I think you need to somehow, because someday, God knows when, but, you know, someday it might matter. But even the government itself, you look at its actions, the authorities in China, in practice, they, I think, accept in their mind that Tibet is very different. After all, the only region they signed an agreement like the 17-point agreement with was Tibet. And they never offered anything like that to Taiwan. They didn't do it for Hong Kong. They didn't do it for, you know, Mongolia, Xinjiang, wherever, all these other areas like Manchuria, nothing. So, I mean, that in itself accepts in some form that A, Tibet is different. B, that Tibet was autonomous, independent, whatever word you want to use, but was separate. Because it says in Article 2, what happened? Okay? I mean, it says in Article 2 that Tibet returns, which means wasn't part of the mind. So, there is some consciousness there, and then there's a guilty conscience there somewhere. But the fact is that the primary goal, I think, is quite clear. What do you think?
Because my understanding is like since Tibet is a factor, and it is also a factor not in as of now, not in a positive sense, but it's a breaking point for Indian relations. Right.
No, I think it's a positive sense.
Positive.
In fact, my own sense is actually the other way around. In the first place, it's something that makes the Chinese stop, think, and behave, and maybe makes them slightly more honest than they would be otherwise. That's one. But more than that, I think if you look at the longer-term Indian interest, and why does India bother to invest in maintaining the Tibetan identity, Tibetan culture, the transmission of Buddhism? Because ultimately this is about who we are and what kind of country India is and what we want to be in the future. And I don't think you can just, ignore all this. This is a big part of the Indian nation. So I think it's in India's self-interest actually to do so. And I think it's, therefore, I think actually Tibet as a factor is positive in both senses, both in an immediate opportunistic sense vis-a-vis China, but also in the larger sense of what is the purpose of policy, why are we doing all this whether with Tibet, with China, with anyone. Our job is we want to ultimately transform India and that requires us to have some sense of what India is, and that includes, I think, the whole Nalanda tradition. This is a big discussion, actually.
So I will leave the questions to the floor, and if there's any questions and queries, just please tell us.
Yeah, my question is like, even though we are very grateful to government and people of India for having us here in India, so why government of India does not publicly endorse or support middle way approach? Because if we achieve middle way approach, because if we achieve genuine autonomy for Tibet, then that will lead to a neutralization or demilitarization of Tibet, which in a way also ensures resolution of China-India border problem. And there is one question. And my second question, I have two questions. My second question is, what future prospect do you see for Tibet, keeping in mind three factors? Number one, post Dalai Lama period, and second is President Xi's extended tenure, and third is resilience of Central Tibetan administration and its middle way policy. Thank you.
Well, firstly, I think India should be grateful to you rather than the other way around, maybe both ways. Because if you look at what you have achieved as a community, the Tibetan community, I cannot think of another case in history actually of a community which came out, driven out of their own land, came in such pitiable condition and has been a success. And you made a success of it yourself. It's not India who did this. You did the hard work, educated your own people, skilled yourself, went out into the world, and you made this success of your community. And we should be grateful to you for having done that actually. And it's really quite a remarkable achievement that I don't think the world actually understands this. There are several refugee communities. You did another thing which very few communities in your position have managed, which is to maintain your identity and to stay also in the world's consciousness as a community. I mean, the others have, if you look at other communities which were in similar positions, the Armenians and so on, none of them have actually managed this. That's quite an achievement. I really think so. So, I think gratitude needs to go both ways rather than just one way. About the future and why doesn't India support the middle way? We've always taken the stance that it's for the Tibetans to decide their future, and if you want to discuss what your future is with the government in China, then that's between you. In fact, one of our problems in 50 was once the 17-point agreement is signed, then it leaves very little room for anybody else to actually get into it. So if that's our position, that this is for you to decide your future, then who are we to tell you this middle way is the way, or this is not the way, or do this or do that? There has to be a limit to what we interfere. Privately, we'll shut the door and we'll tell you our opinion. Indians are never nervous about telling you their opinion. And that you've lived here. But that doesn't mean we should take a public position as a government on what is primarily your business. I don't think that's something, and that's something that frankly is within the community. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but about the future, you know, there's only one thing that is certain, and that is change. Nothing is permanent. None of this. So, you know, when you look around and you say, oh, look at the preponderance of Chinese power and things are looking really grim. I mean, I don't think in 1959 any of us would have predicted what the community would make of itself, where we'd be today. In 1969, we would never have guessed that China would ever have pulled itself out of the Cultural Revolution, made itself into what it is. I mean, even in 91, when we started reform, nobody knew what India would become. So I'll be very careful about predicting. But for me, what is important is that you must, in times, particularly in times of uncertainty like now, you must maintain your assets and your strengths. And what's your strength? Your tradition, your religion, your culture, your identity. These things you cannot let go. There's always a risk of assimilation, of various other forms of, and you know, but those are things that cannot be traded and should never be traded, and especially in times of uncertainty. You need to, I think, for me, that is the only way forward. But to ask me to predict where will we be, I'm an old man, I've seen so much change, I'm not going to predict.
Well, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. My question is somewhat similar to what he asked, but I think slightly different from the fact that my question raised from what you said in the last part of your talk about not having any fixed position because the world changes so fast. Since August 2011, we have had a new leadership, democratically elected, to whom His Holiness has devolved all his political powers. So, in the event that His Holiness is no longer with us, is there any likelihood that government of India will have changed its position towards Tibet policy and also in terms of its treatment of the Tibetan refugees here? And consequently, does government of India has any set approach towards recognition and selection of the 15th Dalai Lama?
Yeah, on whether government of India will change position on the Tibet question as a whole, I don't. I presume that if circumstances change, other things change, yes, position will also evolve accordingly, but I don't know how that I can't answer. On the whole reincarnation issue, I've said this before, I think. For me, this is primarily a religious issue, and it should be settled religiously. The job of the politics is to facilitate the implementation of that religious decision. That's all. Now, by passing a law in 2007, issuing orders, regulations, what the Chinese are trying to do is make it into a political issue. And if we make it political, we are actually playing that game. We're actually opening it up. Now, there's two parts to this. The trouble is that today, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is an international institution. And that's a fact today. And that's thanks to His Holiness himself, to what he has done. And so, but this is not something that, international society can only be supportive. It cannot substitute for that religious process of reincarnation and the sanctity of that. Because it is primarily a religious issue, and we need to keep it that way. Which is why I don't think it's for the government of India to say this is the way to do it, that's the way to do it. I think once there's a clear religious process in place, then it's for the politicians, for the politics, for the government to try and see how it can help to make sure that it's implemented. And that's a decision that I think His Holiness and the Tibetans themselves will first take. And once you have clarity on that, then I think the rest will follow. But I think it's very dangerous for government to start meddling, in which case we accept the fact that an atheist communist party is ready to pass laws about reincarnation. I mean, this doesn't make sense, frankly, to me or to anybody. But I think we need to keep that distinction between politics and religion in this case.
The problem I see here is that the way China looks at the question of Tibet is there's the issue of Dalai Lama is almost tantamount. The moment you solve the question of Dalai Lama, then Tibet almost assume that the question of Tibet doesn't exist. That's one of the reasons why in the early 80s they proposed 5-point plan for the Dalai Lama. But in some way similar to that line, also the fact that Tibetan government, Central Tibetan Administration was established, Central Tibetan Administration of Dalai Lama. And same with the Tibetan Medical Center, for example, Tibetan Medical and Astro Institute of Dalai Lama. So my problem, or the way I see things is the way China looks at Dalai Lama and the way government India also looks at Dalai Lama is there's almost kind of the person of the Dalai Lama and the institution itself. Under which,
as His Holiness himself says, it's not about the Dalai Lama. When they came out with their 5 points, what did he say? He said that's not the issue here. It's about the Tibetan people and the transmission of the religion and the identity and the culture. He said it's not about this. It's about the welfare of the people. It's about, so he himself made it quite clear. And I think that's the position that the government of India would support and has supported so far. So I don't think the government of India's position is analogous to the Chinese government's position on this issue. And in any case, as I said, on reincarnation, I think it's, it is going to be contested anyway. So why do you want to contest it on the grounds where the other people are strongest? Deal with it as a religious issue and then see what you do about the politics of it. Because the politics anyway are going to be contentious. It's that, I think you might as well take it for granted.
First of all, I'd like to really thank you for being here, because we have always believed that Shiv Shankar Banerjee is the mother of all foreign policy. I've been interacted with your uncle in Kerala International Center. We were blessed with his guidance and his enlightenment. I have several questions, and I would be selfish enough to ask all of them. When you arrived here, I remember 2003, Prime Minister Vajpayee's visit to China when you were ambassador then. We thought that there was a major shift of India's policy then, when India, in the joint communique, declared Tibet autonomous region instead of Tibet as the part of PRC. So there was a big jolt in the exile community. We thought that that was a major shift. And especially last week we had one Chinese so-called scholar here who said that we should fight for Ta, not Tibet, because he used to say something else from their perspective. So being present at that moment in Beijing when that declaration was made, what was the real factors which really made this policy shift, that we believe it was a shift, but the government explained something else? Foreign Minister Jaswant Sinhaji.
Yes,
He explained a few days. So that was one question. And during your foreign secretaryship and NSA in 2010, we believe that there was also a shift which we appreciated a lot and still do. The government, the UPA government, then decided not to reiterate its policy stand on Tibet during the joint communique declarations of leaders meeting, and I think it still stands today. Indian government doesn't reiterate the statement that Ta is a part of PRC. That's a bit of a bliss for us. We really appreciated that, although there isn't a major shift in the policy as such. So what are the factors, and do you think the factors will remain that now the government, Indian government, will stick to that? Because we find that in policy statement of trade relation, Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj did reiterate the statement, not in a political way, but in a trade way. So that's the second question. And third question, recently you have stated that China is trying to split India and Bhutan through Doklam aggression. And we were always told that India will not fight war for Tibet. So in the near future, given this fact that research has
Who told you this? That India won't fight a war for Tibet?
You know, many experts always advise us, don't expect India to fight a war for you, with China. So what I believe was that in the near future, given the facts that China is building up, troops in the Doklam area, and then in near future things may change. So do you think India will fight a war for Bhutan, despite of strategic importance of Doklam for Chicken Neck and Northeastern state? Do you believe that India will fight a war for Bhutan with China in near future? So you also talked about 21-carat strategic policy being adopted by Deng Xiaoping to lay law, have a low profile, not to really assert and hide your strength and everything. Now things have changed. People say that Xi Jinping is trying to assert, and he's been very boisterous about the strength and everything.
Yeah.
Yes. So, is it in the near future is going to have a global replication as such for China? And in your speech, you talked about we need to moderate our expectations because the two countries have moved on. Tibet is a factor though, but when you talk about the liabilities and the leverage a so-called Tibet card is playing, the government has been very practical and pragmatic, and it's time to move on. So is it going to sideline Tibet issue, or is it still a liability or a leverage in future? I think that's it.
I obviously didn't do a very good job in my speech. No, on the two shifts that you mentioned, I don't think there was any intention on Mr. Vajpayee's part. And you know his personal commitment to the Tibetan cause throughout, right from the beginning as an MP. So there was no intention on his part to signal some kind of shift towards, recognizing that Tibet is part of China without the qualifiers and so on. I think, basically the Indian official stand in public has always been Tibet is an autonomous region of China, and in that sense, so it is underlined autonomous. For the Chinese have always underlined region. So they'd rather ignore the autonomous and say Tibet is a region of China. That's it.
Same as in Panjshir?
That's what they would, the way they would read it, but the Indians would always stress the autonomous part of it and also argue for the autonomy in their dealings with the Chinese and so on. But I don't think there was any intention in the 2003 visit, when I was there, to try and signal a shift. What happened in 2010, it actually started from 2008, this not mentioning. The Chinese used to raise Tibet with us. And we would tell them, why don't you settle it directly with the Tibetans and with His Holiness? If you have issues about what they're saying or doing, or don't talk to us, talk to them. And then we told them, I think in 2006, I remember telling them, why don't you deal directly? You want us to tell you what to say, we'll even tell you. Then of course they sat back and said, no, of course not. After that, they also shifted to a position of saying, this is our internal matter, nobody else has any space in this issue. And because I think they realized that by raising it, they were actually opening the door to other people actually taking a role in it. And that they didn't want internationalization of the issue itself. And so from both points of view, that we honestly think that it's something that is for the Tibetans to decide. If the Chinese have issues, they should raise it directly with the Tibetans and His Holiness. And so that's why what you mentioned, the no reiteration in subsequent communiques and so on. But I'd be very careful about basing your understanding of policy on words in communiques. Words are useful indicators maybe of present conditions and so on, but ultimately states act on their interests, not on words. Words are only a way of signaling. And signaling is not always a full reflection of reality. In fact, normally it's not. So you have to look at what, the Chinese say, listen to what people say, but look at what they do. You must watch what people do on the ground rather than, And I think that's, if you look at what India has done on Tibet and what China does on Tibet, I think that really gives you a much more accurate guide than all these words and communiques and passing them and splitting infinitives. On Doklam, do I expect war tomorrow? No. I don't if deterrence works. And the whole point of what happened was to deter and to prevent a war by showing that you cannot keep changing the status quo just when it suits you, because it has consequences. If you don't want those consequences, presumably you won't end up in a war. So I hope that's not where it's going. Yes, China shifted away from the 24-character strategy. I mean, Xi Jinping is the one who said from further away. We now show our responsibility at the 19th Congress. He speaks of China taking center stage, performing its role, etc., in the world. Much more assertive foreign policy, and you see it practice. You've seen it since 2008 in practice, all the way around China and in South China Sea, everywhere. So that is true. It is, and that's why I think the world is much more uncertain today than it was before. But I don't ever use the word Tibet card. And I don't like it. That's why I started by saying, you don't want to be just a lever or somebody else's instrument of policy. And I don't think, if I were Tibetan, I wouldn't think of myself in those terms. I wouldn't even analyze the problem in those terms, because you don't want to encourage other people to start acting on that. And certainly that's not, I think, how India has ever looked at this issue. As here's something that's useful, we can use it, and when we don't need it, we throw it away. That's not how we looked at it. And certainly, if you look at our history, we've had governments of every possible shade, political, right, left, center, wherever. But they've been consistent. They've gone right through doing, behaving the same way on this. And I don't think we should look at it that way. In fact, it annoys me when there are Indian commentators and so on who use this word. Because it shows a certain, not just a lack of humanity, but a lack of understanding of how the world works. And of what really matters, and what you should be doing in policy. I really have a problem with that. So, because if you are a lever, a card, then yes, all the sidelining, this, that, all that is possible. But that's not the way to go, and I don't think that's where we're going. I certainly think our record shows that that's not where we want to go.
So,
Sorry, I have one more question. Sorry. You have had an almost lifelong first-hand dealing with China. India follows democratic process and accountability and rule of law in negotiating, and also India invests, I think, years, sometimes decades, in reaching some kind of agreement with China, then breaks and disregards at any time. So I wonder, what are some of the lessons that India learned, and what advice would you give to Tibetans who are trying to kind of bring China ethics to a dialogue table?
At one level, international relations is a tough business, because you make only two assumptions. It's not about trust and understanding and gratitude and affection or none of this, sympathy. You assume, one, that who you're dealing with is rational. And you have to, because otherwise it is irrational, and how do you analyze what you're doing? Two, you assume that he will follow his self-interest. That's it. You don't make any other assumptions. But if he follows his self-interest, and if your interests coincide, even if in that Venn diagram it's a tiny little coincidence, then his behavior is predictable. Then he will stick to the agreements that you can sign any agreement you like, but if it doesn't serve his interest, nobody is going to implement it. And this is not unique to China. It's true of all powers. And the greater the power, the more the level of freedom she feels she has to do this. The less power she has, the less she feels she can do, break agreements, do whatever. But the fact is, all countries, there isn't a boundary on earth today which is where it was 200 years ago. Not even the US-Canada boundary is where it was 200 years ago. Why? Because power shifts. The balance of power changes. And all these agreements, boundaries, everything reflect a certain moment of time. It's a certain balance of power. It's a product of a certain situation and balance. It's a snapshot. But like any snapshot, it's only true for that moment. So long as that interest which led to that snapshot being taken remains, it will keep being implemented. And that's all that I think. So at one level, it's a heartless business. It's a difficult business. And that's partly the nature of international society, because there is no overwhelming sanction or ability to enforce treaties. There's no international authority. There's no Supreme Court of the world which actually functions the way domestic law and so on does. So it's much more difficult to predict. But that's the only lesson that I would draw from 42 years in diplomacy. It's not unique to China. And I think that's true wherever you go. It's a bigger issue. It's the nature of international society rather than. But I'd be very careful drawing too many conclusions there. Yes.
So, since we don't have much time,
I have a small question. I just want to know your opinion about how China will change. No, the reason why I say this is sometimes we try to project the struggle of Tibet in a very positive way, and when we go out to different countries, meet with the decision makers and the parliamentarians, we see that things are not that rosy as we perceive. So most of the time we'll get questions like, do you really think the Tibet issue will be solved? And this is such a big question to us, because when we went to Switzerland, which is a big supporter of Tibet, now since the shift of the finance has been jolted by President Trump or whosoever, they are in so much of in line with Chinese policy, and even they were so scared to talk about Tibet also. So we had to really tell them that as much as you want China, China wants you. So on a sovereign same status, you should be able to stand up for the human right and whatever righteousness that is enshrined in your constitution. If you are not able to stand up for your constitutional righteousness, then what do you stand for? That was my question. So they told me that, I mean, whenever we talk about Tibet, it becomes politics. And it angers China. So that was their take. And then I said, without angering the Chinese leadership, don't you have anything to do with the people who are voiceless, who don't have any platform in the international arena to talk about their grievances? They said, we have. We are trying to do. But then this is totally contrasting your own talk. So when we were put up that question, I told that if China has to change, it will change from within. That was my rhetoric. But whenever we have any meeting or whenever we have any parliamentary resolution, we always resolve to urge, to impress upon. So I'm just in a dilemma to think, should we impress upon, should we pressurize, should we ask other leaders to pressurize Chinese leadership, or will the change come from within? Because for me, it looks like the molten lava is still burning. It's a matter of how fast it will rupture or how slow it will rupture from within. So I just want to listen to your opinion on this. And one thing is, just a few days back, President Macron, he made a mention of Tibet and the things that are going around. How should we read this? And how would you read this between the lines? I just want to listen to it.
About China changing, China's already changing. If you look at Chinese society and the economy, they're both much less liable to control Which is why in the last 5 years China spent more on internal security than she has on national defense, on the PLA. And you see this tremendous increase in surveillance, in internet monitoring, and I mean, basically in controls on society, partly because their ability to control society is much less. Less than 16% of all Chinese today get their salary from state-owned enterprises. So, which means that most people don't depend on the state in the same way that nobody in China today asks you which unit do you belong to, which used to be the first Western, because you Shamatangli, they used to ask. You're no longer, the units don't count, the state units don't count the way they used to. And society and the economy have become much less manageable. I mean, still, state-owned enterprise is about 30% of GDP. That's sizable. And the banks still control a lot, but these are limited levers apart compared to what they had in the past. Where in municipal order, you could set everything in the past. You no longer can. So it's changing, but where it's going is very hard to say. As I said, therefore the regime relies much more on ultranationalism, on chauvinism, and frankly, there is no guarantee, as we've seen in other examples, that democracy doesn't actually bring, much stronger nationalist, other kinds of extreme ideas to the fore. Doesn't give them, because you have another phenomenon going on. You have urbanization. By 2025, 70% of China will be urban, the population. And this means you've taken people out of their traditional family, their villages, their support structure, put them alone, alienated in an urban environment, and subject to mass media and social media. So essentially, politics becomes mass psychology, becomes mob psychology. It becomes a politics of emotion. And you see this everywhere. I mean, it's not only China. At the same time, when I go to China and what I see, at the street, at the individual level, you see more instances of kindness to other people, to strangers, than you ever saw before in China, or than you see in many other parts of the world. Some old person is crossing the street, some people have carry their bag, move them across, avoid the traffic. This kind of thing. So there is, in other words, there's an individual capacity to create space for themselves within a system which otherwise tries to control everything. And where this ends up, it's very hard to predict. It's also changing in the sense that by 2040, China will have the same age structure as Japan, which is the grayest of the advanced economies today. Now that's another huge shift. And so, they'll get old probably before they get rich. And that becomes a different kind of society again. So there are fundamental changes going on in China, and I'm very nervous of predicting what it will look like, or how China will behave. The trouble in China is that there is a clear disconnect between society, the economy, reality, and how policies are made and so on. But there's a limit to how long you can keep that. That's why you need to increase surveillance, it's creating tension between the two. Whether, as you said, whether it's molten lava which will come out, whether, how it will be resolved, or whether they'll change, whether they're clever enough to change the way of governments, the way they run the country. I don't know. I cannot predict. And it's hard to see, very hard to see right now. But yes, we will. So my own sense, therefore, is that to answer your question, I think over the next 10 years at least, we'll see big changes in China, the way it's going. And ultimately, it has to translate into policy as well. And but it's going to be very difficult for us to predict what, therefore, they do on an issue, say on Tibet, on India. That's very hard to say. I can't say where they'll come down. Where do you think it's going?
Pardon?
Where do you think it's going? No, and frankly, the second part of it about the rest of the world. The rest of the world changes. And it will keep changing. The rest of the world, And I think what you did is right. You have to appeal to their better natures. And they have to look in the mirror at the end of the day, you know. Think about what they are doing. But that you have to do. But I don't think that's a very solid leg to base our own futures on. I think that's not.
So as a convener, since you already said it's really hard to go for future, predict the future, but I will ask you one last question. So it's a personal question. Since if you have seen over here, most origins are born after 1959, and you've been there in Tibet before 1959. So can you please tell me about your experience, because you stayed there for 3 years, and you're more Tibetan than us actually. So can you please tell us about your own experience about your childhood in Tibet?
Look, I was a little child. for me, Lhasa that was a magical place. Because, you know, it's a place where I learned to swim in the Bichu River, I learned to ride a bicycle, I had friends. There was no school, which was wonderful. My mother was teaching me, and you know how that works. It doesn't work. So, it was really one of the happiest times of my life. So you don't want to know mine. It's not, you know, it's for me, personally, yes, it's very valuable, but it's not really relevant to what we're discussing.
Wonderful. So since we don't have much time, since last day is leaving a few hours, so one of us, a big thank you to our distinguished speaker, Ambassador Shipshin Manji, and I hope that in the future also come to Dharamsala to give us more insights about India-China, Tibet issues, and since it's valuable to us to know more about the perspectives about what's going on, because it's a struggle, it's a moving struggle. So in the process, we need a light. So you are one of the light for us to give us a direction where we should go. So thank you so much for your enlightening speech. Thank you. On behalf of TPR, President of our journals and